Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about one of the aspects of why sometimes an ending works for us or an ending seems to fall flat. And this is an aspect called closure, narrative closure. Now, people may be familiar with closure from psychological closure, emotional closure, this idea of finishing things off. And this applies to narrative as well. One of the most common pieces of advice or a rule of creative writing is always provide your reader with closure. And the thing is, like all aspects of these rules for creative writing, it's not set in stone that this is about a general rule that you follow to create a certain effect. And that's what I want to talk about, because closure is an effect that affects the reader. It's the feeling of satisfaction that the major narrative points have been resolved. And that is basically closure in a nutshell. When a narrative concludes and the major aspects have been resolved, the reader feels a sense of completeness, that the narrative is over and finished, and there aren't any loose ends hanging around, or there aren't any big loose ends hanging around. And that makes an ending feel satisfying. So you can see why the general advice is always give your readers closure. But, and there's always a but in these things, that's not the end of the story. So what I want to do in this video is talk a little bit about narrative closure and go into it in a little tiny bit more depth to give you a general sense about it, because like kernels and satellites as a way to think about narrative events in a story that help us pick up and understand what are the main things, what are the important things, and what are the things that, while interesting, are not pivotal. And narrative kernels and narrative satellites help us do that with narrative events. Understanding the concept of closure in combination with those things can help us understand the ending of a narrative and the effect that it creates in us as readers. And it can help us pinpoint why an ending works for us or why an ending doesn't work for us. So the first thing to note is narrative closure does not mean that all aspects of every part of the narrative must be concluded. That is not a thing. And the easiest way to illustrate this is if we think of a nice clear-cut example, Star Wars: A New Hope. In that, at the beginning, the princess gets kidnapped. The plans of the enemy weapon are out in the wild, and the young hero finds the plans, rescues the princess, and then destroys the enemy weapon. There you go. The big aspects of this are, did the princess get rescued? Yes. Were the plans important and used? Yes. Did the enemy weapon get destroyed? Also yes. Fantastic. We have narrative closure. The main elements of this narrative are all neatly tied up. And then we have obviously the denouement, where we get the scene where they all get their rewards at the end, and we can all sit there very satisfied and then feel bad for Chewbacca, who didn't get a medal. But ask yourself this: did all aspects of the plot get resolved? You go, well, actually, no. There are two major dangling plot threads. What happened to Darth Vader? Because we saw him spinning out into space at the end. There's no resolution there. And also, wasn't Han Solo being pursued by Jabba the Hutt for failing to do something, and he should have gone to do that and pay Jabba off instead of helping out at the end? Isn't that an unresolved issue? Yes, yes, it is. But Darth Vader's end and what happens to Han Solo are not the major thrust. They aren't the major issues or questions or aspects that Star Wars: A New Hope was focused on. And so we can see that as long as the major aspects are wrapped up, some minor aspects can be dangling plot threads, can be dangling character arcs, can be used as hooks for future story. And what's interesting is if we then move on to, say, Empire Strikes Back, we can see what happens when you don't have narrative closure, because most of Empire Strikes Back doesn't close off the narrative. In fact, it is almost deferring a lot of the resolution to, at the time, a theoretical third film. Because if you think about it, Luke starts off the film, he's training on Dagobah with Yoda. That was a whole big thing. Is he going to become a Jedi? He then quits that and goes off to try and rescue his friends and doesn't continue his training. So the training aspect isn't there. Does he rescue his friends? Well, he's partially successful in rescuing his friends. Han Solo still gets caught. When we think of the other aspects of Empire Strikes Back, the Empire is hunting down the rebels at the start. Do the rebels get away? Well, they kind of get away, but they're still on the run. The Empire is still hunting them. There's no resolution. There's no end point to this. It's just a continuing narrative that hasn't been closed off. When we think of any of the aspects of Empire Strikes Back, there isn't narrative closure at the end. And actually, that shot of Luke and Leia looking out onto the starfield is very much about, yeah, we know this isn't finished. We know this is just the next step in the journey. These things will be resolved at a later date. It has deferred the closure element to a later date. And so fans are left wanting more. Now, we still had a climax in it. We still had revelation in it. We still had something exciting in it. But a lot of those elements are not closed off. They were investigated as sort of part 2 of a story that is going to have at least a part 3. And that's why Empire Strikes Back, the ending of it, feels so different to the ending of Star Wars: A New Hope, which they were making without any intention of it becoming a series, a trilogy, or a franchise. And Return of the Jedi, which again was seen as the end of the trilogy, and that's the end of it, and there weren't going to be any more. So everything basically gets neatly wrapped up there. So you can see the comparisons between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, both using that aspect of closure to close down the elements, the resolution of Luke's training, the resolution of Luke's issue with his father, the resolution of the Empire as a threat, the resolution of Luke or of Leia and Han. All of these things find closure and finality in Return of the Jedi. So that is like a very simple, straightforward way of thinking about all of these elements. But even within all of those 3 films, there are little bits and pieces that just never quite get resolved. They don't seem to go anywhere. And that's fine, as long as the major elements are resolved, as long as they are completed. That's what creates this feeling of closure. That's what creates this feeling of satisfaction. Now, when we think of closure, sometimes it's easy to think of closure meaning a happy ending. So for instance, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the 4 lovers, and a lot of the play is about the complexity of their relationship, but it ends with the 4 lovers all being paired up into 2 couples. There is a happy resolution. The couples are made up of the people who are actually right for each other. And it is a comedic resolution, comedy in the sense of the classical sense, not comedy, ha ha ha. But that's a happy ending. But we can equally use a different Shakespearean play to talk about a tragic ending. And if we look at the tragedy of Macbeth, Macbeth is promised to become king. He does these dastardly deeds. We track his progress as he ascends to the throne. And then Macduff arrives, challenges Macbeth and throws him down, and Macbeth dies a terrible death. And so it is a tragic end for the protagonist being Macbeth. And the antagonist, it is a comedic end for the antagonist, Macduff, because he becomes king. So what we have there is we still have resolution, the major aspect following the rise and fall of Macbeth. The questions about what he will do for kingship, how he will be punished for his evil, all of these sorts of things are resolved within the text. And because of that, we still have closure. It is a completed arc. We aren't left at that scene of Macbeth looking out over the battlements as Birnam Wood walks towards him and Macduff's army is approaching. It doesn't just end there and go, until next week. That would be a lack of closure. But because we get that finale, because we get to see what happens, it is closed off, we finish the arc, and we are satisfied. It is a satisfactory ending. Now, there's an interesting aspect to this, and that is when, unlike in Empire Strikes Back, where yes, we didn't have closure, but in effect, it was deferred closure. It was implied that there would be another film that was going to close off the narrative. It was viewed very much as part one of a story, because Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi are part of the same arc. But what if there is never any closure and closure is completely and utterly denied? Is that a good thing? Can it be a good thing? Because conventional wisdom again says that you must give your reader or your viewer closure. And if we think of the end of, say, one of those Christopher Nolan movies that has ambiguity at the end, we do not know the definitive yes or no. It is left ambiguous. We are denied closure. And that stimulates discussion, debate, people arguing over it, people saying, oh, it must be X or it must be Y. And people get involved. But does that give you the same satisfaction of having the definitive answer? And yes, the definitive answer might momentarily give us a sense of satisfaction, but the ambiguity can actually extend the importance and interest in the film long beyond a film that has full closure. Sorry. So I want to talk now about two different ways of doing this, and I want to discuss Strange New Worlds. Episode 8 of Strange New Worlds, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, called the Elysian Kingdom. And in this, Dr. Mbenga's daughter, who is terminally ill and he's been keeping her in the pattern buffer, he's been reading these fantasy stories, these fairy tale stories to her when he is temporarily spending time with her before putting her back in the buffer. The Enterprise suddenly finds itself at this nebula, but it cannot move. The crew are powerless. The Enterprise is held in place. And it turns out there's a sentient being that is nebulous, non-corporeal, floating around in the nebula. It then has taken control of the ship. It has found the consciousness of Mbenga's daughter, who is also, because she's in the pattern buffer, a non-corporeal being, and is having conversations with her and knows about her desire to change the story. And so for her amusement, this entity makes the crew act out this fairy tale. And Mbenga is pretty much the only person who knows what's really going on. Hemmer as well. But when we go through this whole thing, obviously the major elements of this story are dealing with Mbenga's relationship with his daughter, dealing with her terminal disease. Those are the big facets that this story is investigating. And when we get to the end, Mbenga is basically made an offer by this being, this sentience. And the being will release the ship and release the crew and turn them all back to normal if Mbenga's daughter stays with them in the nebula as an energy being. And Mbenga is faced with this dilemma. Do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one? Do the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many? Very classical sort of Star Trek question to be asking about utilitarian ethics. And in some respects, it ties into a previous episode, the one that was heavily based on Le Guin's Omelas. And in typical fairy tale fashion, we are given an ending. Mbenga, while he is wrestling with this dilemma, wrestling with this question about whether it is the right thing to do, Mbenga's daughter offers. And she essentially, from one way of looking at it, sacrifices herself for the crew, just like her father would have, just like any other member of Starfleet would. She sacrifices herself and says, I will go. But also she is getting her wish. She is being cured of her disease. And now she's getting to go on all of these adventures in the galaxy because she's going to be a non-corporeal sentient being with this other one. And in that moment, she leaves and Mbenga is distraught. And this is where we need to pause because a decision gets made here. At this point, the majority of the aspects of the narrative are concluding. We have the fairy tale narrative being concluded by the actions of the princess taking agency for herself and correcting a mistake of princesses being passive in the fairy tale. The crew of the Enterprise are going to be freed. The Enterprise is going to be freed. Mbenga's daughter is going to be cured. All of these major aspects are being tied up in this moment. But there is one aspect that is not being addressed in this moment, not being completed in this moment. And that is this the right decision? This is the question being posed. Do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one? This is a central question to this. And at this point, the show makes the decision that while Mbenga is distraught at his daughter leaving, he has no idea what is going to happen to her. He fears for her. He has lost his daughter. Mere seconds later, she reappears. The fairy dust comes in. She reappears as a young woman now and says, "Oh, Dad, everything's fine." And now we have complete closure. There's the complete happy fairy tale ending. There's comedic ending. And the crew has been saved. The ship has been saved. And Mbenga's daughter has been saved in a certain way of looking at it. But she has been saved. And Mbenga is no longer tortured by being unable to save his daughter. There is a complete resolution about all of these things. But, and I'm sure you could have heard this coming, this ending doesn't work for me. And the reason it doesn't work is I think in this instance, withholding complete closure would have achieved a much more interesting and engaging narrative ending. Because if, when the daughter leaves, Mbenga never gets that question answered, we are denied closure. We don't know if she is okay. We don't know what happens to her. It is an element that is just left dangling there. If we are denied closure at that instance, there are ramifications for the character that now he will never have resolution about, did he do the right thing? Did he make the right decision? Is his daughter okay? None of that would be answered. Whereas the show decided to answer those questions, I think withholding that closure would have been much more impactful. And it still would have been in line with the narrative created about the fairy tale. We still have those elements. We still have the closure of those elements. We still have the closure of all of the salient points about the crew and the ship. But what we leave open then is an element of closure about Mbenga's character arc. And that, I think, would have been, for me at least, a much more powerful ending by denying closure in that instance. And this is one of those things to think about in terms of when we read, when we get to the end and we go, I am dissatisfied with this. We all can recognize when we don't like an ending. But if we can pinpoint why we don't like the ending. And it's not just about, oh, well, they didn't have a big fight. Or if we actually try to think about what were the questions that were being asked, what was the narrative actually exploring? What did the ending give me? What did it resolve in terms of those things? What did it fail to resolve in terms of those things? The things it did not resolve, are they important to the major aspects of the narrative? Or are they like Han Solo and Jabba? Are they minor little elements that can just be picked up at another time? By understanding these things, we gain a greater understanding of the ending, and we can maybe guess at aspects of authorial intent if that is of interest to us. But it can also help us rethink how we approach the ending and rethink about how we privileged aspects of the narrative. Were we reading it as, oh, this is a military fantasy, therefore it must end in a certain way? And we weren't paying attention to what the signals were throughout the narrative. But like so many of these things, this is just a discussion on it. Your mileage on this may vary, but thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.